Okay, welcome year 10. Today we're doing lesson 3 of our skills revision course on the Western Front. We're looking at transportation, evacuation, and problems with treatment today. Now, before we jump into our session today, I just want us to think about a few things regarding the follow-up question. That's just because common misconceptions have come up, and I just want to really talk you through how to approach this type of question. Now, firstly, the question's asking you, you should, as soon as you see this question, and the whole of Section A really, you are essentially an investigator. You are investigating these sources. And this question's asking you, how could you follow up source C to find out more about, and this next part's the important part, what is it asking you to find out more about? It's asking you to find out more about the problems treating soldiers on the Western Front. Now, in an exam, I would highlight what is the focus here, and I would be thinking about, okay, so the next set of questions that I ask and the details I pick out has to be regarding the problems treating soldiers. So if we look at the first one, so each one accounts for a mark and then 4 marks in total. If you answer the last one but you haven't answered the first 3 and that's correct, you're not going to get the mark because you have to, it's in succession, you have to answer these ones to get the ones below. So for the first question here, it asks you to pick out a detail in the source that you would follow up about a particular topic. So in this case, the problems treating soldiers. So when they're asking you for a detail, the easiest way to make sure you get this mark is to pick out a quote. And in this case, they've picked out a quote from source C. Really engage with what source they're asking you to pick out and what kind of topic they're thinking about. Now, we're thinking about the problems treating soldiers, and the detail that we're going to ask a question about the problems treating soldiers is this one. Reach a point of utter exhaustion when, as a result of trench warfare, their nerves and brains would snap. That's the quote that we've picked out. And that's it. If you pick out a quote, you should be able to get the mark quite easily. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to be asking a question. And you have to pretend you're an investigator, you're a detective, and you're going to ask more questions based on what you've just read to find out about the problems treating soldiers. Now, in this case, it's how well did soldiers recover from shell shock? Now, when we're thinking about a question to ask, it can't be a simple yes or no answer. Phrases that you can think about to really, make sure that you are asking good questions is thinking about, let's say my quote here is reach a point of utter exhaustion when, as a result of trench warfare, their nerves and brains would snap. So I might ask, was this a typical, so typical is a nice word, response to warfare? Or I might ask about a particular range or the effect of something. Was this a common effect of shell shock? How was the response towards how was the response towards soldiers who suffered from shell shock? And so on. Now, the point of this question is you need to be asking a question that will lead to another answer. So really, it can't be something that is a simple yes or no. You need to be trying to ask good questions. Now, the reason why a big misconception that has come up was the idea of what type of source I could use. Now, a few of us thought that, they must be talking about the sources available, and thought, okay, well, I would use source A or I would use source C. This question is not designed for you to look at the sources that we give you, that are in the exam. This question is designed for you to think about all the sources that are possible to have, what would be effective to use for a particular type of question. So I might say, let's say if my question was, let's just keep to the ones that we already have. So how well did soldiers recover from shell shock? Well, who would know? What source could we go to that would tell us how well soldiers recovered? Because we're thinking about the treatment of soldiers. And in this case, we chose a personal account. Now, if I was to just say personal account, that's not going to be enough to get us that mark. A personal account of whom? It's very vague to say personal account. Okay, personal account from soldiers. Okay, gets better, personal account from soldiers, but we can even be more specific, a personal account from soldiers who had suffered from shell shock. Yes, that makes sense. And it's going to help you with your next question, because after you talk about the specific type of source you're going to use, so a personal account from a soldier who suffered shell shock, you then are going to be able to easily explain your rationale for it. Diaries and memoirs would help me understand the impact that shell shock had on the sufferer after the war and if the consequences were long term, thus answering your questions about the problems treating soldiers. If you were to, pick out another quote that was about doctors seeing them as cowards, and you might ask a question like, was this a typical response from the medical community or the RAMC on the Western Front? What type of source you could use? Nursing notes from a nurse who treated shell shock on the Western Front. How might this help? Because nursing notes hold notes of treatment and potential problems and talk about the short-term and long-term consequences with soldiers under their care. And that's how you'd answer that too. Another example of how you can answer it. So the big take homes here is make sure you answer all of them. Make sure your question and your quote is relevant. If it's a picture or a photograph, etc., you just describe what you're seeing. Your source is record, so some type of source. It might be a photograph, it might be a diary, it might be a newspaper article, but you need to be very, very specific. Don't just say, oh, from source C or from source A. That question is not asking you to look at the previous sources. And then this is you explaining how your source is going to help answer your question. I'm just going to quickly check to see we're still recording because it ended last time. It's fine. Okay, so now we can move on to today's lesson. I'm going to show you what you're doing. So first of all, we're looking at the chain of evacuation and transportation. So like I said in the beginning, we're looking at evacuation and we're looking at transportation. Now on your screen now, I have put up an example of some form of train of evacuation. And now you have what you may remember from year 9, something to help you remember what this was. What the chain of evacuation was. So hopefully this is jogging your memory to just kind of help you out there. We obviously start, so when we think about chain of evacuation, where do we start where people were hurt is obviously the front line. Now, where is it that they are going next? It's, near the reserve trenches. What can we see? If we look at the bold, we should be able to remember that we go to the regimental aid post. And then what I want you to do is just pause the video, just have a think, looking at the bold letters, can you figure out what are the next sections in the system of the chain of evacuation? Okay, hopefully you were able to understand and remember what the chain of evacuation was, and it's regimental aid post, dressing station, casualty clearing station, base hospital, and hospital ship. So this is the chain of evacuation. Now, obviously, the more treatment you require, the further you are going to go. You should be able to remember, and hopefully it's refreshing your memory about what's available at certain places and what happens there. So let's say if we go to our regimental aid post, what can we expect there? We're probably expecting simple treatment, dressing up wounds, that kind of stuff. Something that doesn't require any further help. And we come across a system that happens in a few places called a triad system, in which the person there would be separating people, let's say in this case, people who can walk, people who require further treatment, etc. And you should be able to remember. So if we go down to a dressing station, if you went to Belgium in year 9, we went to a dressing station and it was that stone, really small, crowded, not too far from the front line area. That, dark stone, very, very thin area where people would, again, get certain level of treatment. You then move on to the casualty clearing station if, you still need further treatment, and this would be where typically abandoned buildings or tents. Base hospital. Now, if you are someone who's going to the base hospital, probably means that you require heavier treatment because that's where you've got the equipment. And remember, we're thinking Western Front, so we're thinking within Western Europe. And then if you were really in a bad condition, you would be sent home to England. Now, obviously, when we think about the chain of evacuation, we still need to think, well, how do people get from each part of the system? And that's where your first activity comes in. Your first activity is to look at the 6 images and to list what you can see and how people would have been transported from each part of the chain of evacuation. So in this case, your 6 images, I would just literally list them. I'll do the first one for you. We know that we can have stretcher bearers. And you should be thinking, as you go through the chain of evacuation, you should be thinking, well, what would happen? What is able to happen given the limitations? For example, front line to regimental aid post. How would someone get there? Yeah, they could go by stretcher bearers, or, they would probably realistically walk if they were able to. It would be unlikely to, for example, have a motor ambulance in this case. You need to be thinking and refreshing your memory on where those things would be needed, and on your forms, you're just listing the 6 images to find out the modes of transportation in the chain of evacuation. Once you finish that, we're going to move on to our skills section of today, and you'll be looking at this image over here. Now, this source is a photograph showing soldiers on stretchers outside a dressing station. Now, straight away, when you have that information, stretchers outside a dressing station, what can you assume is happening? You can assume, you don't, obviously, everything that every conclusion that you make, anything you assume is an inference. We can make an inference that potentially they are waiting to be transported to casualty clearing stations. We can make an inference, the fact that there are so many of them on the floor and little modes of transportation, that actually, so if we look over here, what can you infer from source B about how effective the chain of evacuation was? When we think about effective, we need to be thinking about, was something, was it a good speed? Does it make sense? Was it working well? Did it have the best outcome for those soldiers who require treatment? Did that mode of transportation make sense? Now, if you look at this image and you consider that maybe these people are waiting for treatment, you may argue actually this source suggests it's not that effective because they're potentially waiting for treatment. You may argue, you may infer that this chain of evacuation is not effective because of the fact that they're outside. But what does that suggest about the inside of the dressing station? Thinking about the knowledge that you know of how small a dressing station is, you can make an inference about how little transportation vehicles there are, about the manpower there is, about the equipment that's used. And that's what you need to be doing. You get 2 marks, 1 mark for the source suggests, so anything you can infer, so any assumption or conclusion you make about the chain, about how effective the chain of evacuation was from this image, and then an example. So obviously it's not a written piece, so you would be picking out details from the image or using the caption. Once you finish, you can do the exact same for source C. What can you infer from source C about how effective the chain of evacuation was? And again, we're thinking about how effective it is, we're thinking about manpower, speed, outcome, impact on health. That's what we need to be thinking about. Is it effective? So I'll read it with you. The Royal Army Medical Corps REMC orderlies dared not lift me from the stretcher to a hospital train bunk for fear of it starting to hemorrhage in the lung. So they laid the stretcher above it, with the handles resting on the headrail and footrail. I had now been on the same stretcher for 5 days. I remember the journey as a nightmare. My back was sagging and I could not raise my knees to relieve the cramp. The bunk above me was only a few inches away. Now, this man is talking about his experience in the chain of evacuation. So we know that he's on a train and he's in a stretcher. What does it suggest about the effectiveness? What does it suggest about, this unknown fear of something happening? What, about the qualifications of those people and ability of those people surrounding him? What does it suggest about the fact that, the time, he's been there for 5 days, the fact that he remembered it as a nightmare, the fact that the bunk was only a few inches away? What does that suggest about how crowded it was? And that's how you should be looking at a source. You should be thinking about what can you learn from this source about how effective it was, and then again, picking a quote. And you get 2 marks, one for your inference, one for the quote. After you've done that, you then need to look at the provenance. Now, I've given you the provenance, and for lesson 4, I think I'm going to want you to identify what the provenance is. So really practice that skill. Now, when we think about the provenance, we're thinking about the nature, the origin, and the purpose. And we're looking at source C. So this one's asking you about source C. What is the nature of source C? So source C is Robert Graves, an officer in the Welsh Fusiliers, was wounded in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Here he recounts his journey on a train back to England. Now, the nature of this source, while ambiguous, it's a description. We know it's a description from someone's memories. What's the origin? Who wrote it? When did they write it? What's happening? When was it from? We know it's a description from Officer Robert Graves. Now, Robert Graves alone, we don't know who that is. But the fact we know he's an officer and he was wounded in the Battle of the Somme, we now know that this is a memory from a soldier who fought in a very deadly battle, the Battle of Somme. So the question, when you think about provenance, it's great that you can identify it, but you really need to explain how that makes it useful to you. Why is that source now useful? So how does the nature and the origin of the source, the fact that it's a description from a soldier, make the source useful in telling us about how effective the chain of evacuation was? Why is it that his experience is useful to us? And this is where you need to be using, those key phrases, first-hand experience, stuff like that. Your sentence starter I've given to you, and you gain 1 point for doing that. And then lastly, you are just going to write down a paragraph for the question, how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the chain of evacuation? Now, again, I've done source B for you, and you are just doing source C. So I'm going to talk you through source B for a little bit and show you, I'll read out what I've done here. So source B is useful for an inquiry into the chain of evacuation as it shows us, this one here, the conditions and inefficiency of the chain of evacuation. That's my point. I then go on to make some inferences. For example, source B is a picture, so I'm going to have to pick out some detail, shows soldiers lined up on stretchers outside a dressing station. The soldiers who are waiting to be transported to a casualty clearing station, which I know from my own knowledge, are in large numbers lying down on the floor. Sorry. The number of soldiers and lack of transportation, as we can see in the picture, suggests that the chain of evacuation, which allowed the transportation of soldiers, was inefficient. By being placed outside the dressing station, we can infer that the dressing station was full of other patients and could not hold the amount of people that needed attended to. We can deduce that the soldiers who had medical problems were placed on the floor, and the large quantity suggests that there were large delays which contributed to knock-on effects, thus creating further medical issues due to the delay in treatment. Now, this is why we're making inferences. We're assuming that this is what makes it efficient. The fact that people lying there for God knows how long, they're going to have further delay. The fact that they're outside the dressing station in the cold, European weather, that suggests that it's overcrowded, lack of, cars, that suggests that it's inefficient. That's how you make inferences. Now, I've made quite a few, and you can do that too. Then I'm going to move on to my provenance. The value of the source can be decreased. So normally I actually start off with increase, but this time I'm going to argue actually it's decreased. The value of the source can be decreased because its origin, so when or who took it. It is taken during a battle in 1917. The photograph may not be necessarily representative of the process of evacuation throughout the war, but only at times of higher casualties, because it's a battle. Its usefulness is also limited because we are only shown a part of the area, and we are unaware of how long the soldiers were waiting outside the dressing station, because naturally it's a photograph. We're only seeing a section of a story. Despite this, I then go to say actually it is useful. The provenance does make it useful. You can stop there and say it's decreased, but you can also argue it's increased. Despite this, the value of the source is also increased because it's a photograph taken outside the dressing station. It therefore gives us a visual snapshot in time. Nice little phrase there when you think about photographs. Showcasing the chain of evacuation in practice in the First World War. So that's our provenance. Consequently, source B is useful for an inquiry into the chain of evacuation, actually into how effective the chain of evacuation was, as it showcases the failures of the chain of evacuation and how overwhelmed the system was. Now, that's me just thinking back to the question and focusing that I'm talking about how useful this source is for me when I'm thinking about the chain of evacuation. Now, what you might have noticed is I've missed out knowledge, and I wanted to show you that actually you can still get top marks by really developing your inferences and your provenance. You do not need the knowledge, so you don't need to panic as long as you are really developing your provenance and your inference skills. But if I was to add knowledge, I would make sure that I'm putting it somewhere where it is relevant. So I might put it in here and say, this is unsurprising given the high casualties of the Battle of Arras in 1917, in which they came to a stalemate. Something that is relevant. There's no point just plugging in random knowledge. You need to really make sure it matches up to what you are talking about. So that's what a paragraph can look like. And all you have to do is to write your paragraph for source C. So how useful is source C for an inquiry into the effectiveness of the chain of evacuation, and then you use the sentence starters to write down your answer as you normally would. Okay, thank you.